35-year-old Diana Hahn was a wannabe fashion model, working a deli counter instead of walking a runway.
Her dreams are really not going anywhere.
36-year-old Michael Daly wouldn't grow up or take no for an answer.
He pretty much always got what he wanted.
From their first smoldering glance, they couldn't keep their hands off each other.
Before long, they were making out in the stockroom.
It's, whoa, combustible.
But their fiery love affair would soon lead to a horrifying crime.
It's a horribly mutilated body.
The head is nearly severed. It's all kinds of broken bones.
Now get the inside story of this haunting tale of abduction and revenge. And learn how a collision of desires became a roadmap for murder.
You have trains colliding. It's like the perfect storm of two kinds of crazy.
June 1st, 1996. For almost 3 weeks, volunteers had searched the remote woods outside Ventura, California for a missing mother of 2.
People that she helped all around the neighborhood and community, everybody was looking for her.
After hours combing the brush, 2 searchers realized they were covering old ground. Disheartened, they considered calling it a day, until a chance look revealed that they'd missed something.
You have all these people searching along this ravine, and they find the kind of thing that you would hope you would never see.
One search party did discover some human remains in a ravine.
The shocked volunteers called for help. When investigators arrived, it was immediately clear that whoever this person was, their end had been extremely violent.
This body had been stabbed several times. The head is nearly severed. It's all kinds of broken bones.
The upper spinal cord had been severed.
But was this the missing mom the entire community had been seeking? And if so, who killed her and why? The answers to those questions would ultimately expose a shocking conspiracy of murder and betrayal, and put police on the hunt for a pair of utterly remorseless killers. Located in Ventura County, Port Hueneme, California is renowned for its thriving beach scene. But for young Diana Hahn, life in the Southern California coastal community was rarely sunny. Diana was raised in a loving household by her Japanese mother and Caucasian father. But into her teens, she struggled with her self-esteem, making her an outsider among her classmates.
She grew up with, stereotypical blonde California girls, and she was, dark hair and always different.
She was a lonely child, not a lot of friends.
But when Diana was 15, a brush with death turned her life in an entirely new and unexpected direction. A basketball backboard fell on her in gym class, and the accident left her in intensive care.
She's in a coma for a couple of days. This was a very, very serious accident.
The brush with death had lifted Diana's spirits. She came to with a new sense of purpose and pride.
She wakes up and decides that she wants to change herself.
She fully recovered and goes through what seems to be a transformation.
In the months after the accident, Diana worked hard to bring her outward appearance into line with her new inward resolve.
She becomes more lively, more extroverted.
It's kind of like the ugly duckling story. And now she's this really hot chick.
Diana's engaging new persona earned her a seat alongside the popular girls, and a new look ensured she was rarely without a date. But Diana had her eye on a bigger prize than a shot at homecoming queen.
Diana, like so many young women in Southern California, has ambitions of becoming a big model.
Right off the bat, Diana booked print work. Her portfolio soon showcased the natural ability to transform that had helped make her so popular at school.
She was like a chameleon, looking one way one day and something entirely different the next.
Diana felt she had no limits. She was determined to take the world by storm. After graduating from high school, Diana enrolled at Oxnard College. Her positive attitude put her on the dean's list 2 semesters in a row. But proving herself in school was less important than her making waves in the modeling world. Unfortunately, after a few preliminary successes, Diana discovered that neither her looks nor her ambition made her stand out from Southern California's thousands of pretty model wannabes.
It's a tough business. It's a lot tougher for her than she thought.
Into her 20s, Diana booked sporadic print and fashion jobs while increasingly supplementing her income doing less glamorous day jobs. Waitress, bank teller, clerk, postal worker. The one thing the jobs all had in common was that they weren't modeling. By the time she was 32, Diana had to admit to herself that her fantasy career was just that.
Her dreams in this industry are really not going anywhere. She's working odd jobs, really sort of floating around in outer space.
In December of 1993, Diana took a job behind the deli counter at a local supermarket. While her looks may not have attracted modeling agents, Diana still got plenty of attention from customers and co-workers, especially from her manager, Michael Daly, who would change Diana's life in ways she'd never imagined. Like Diana, Michael was a local boy who'd grown up in a biracial family.
Michael Daly's father was Hispanic. His mother was Japanese from Japan.
But unlike Diana, Michael's childhood was both stable and comfortable.
He was an altar boy. Grew up in sort of like this very tight-knit family.
When Michael reached high school, his secure, approving home life made him a confident and charming young man.
He was such a laid-back guy that kind of gave off that cool, laid-back feel to him, and everybody liked him.
Most popular guy in high school. He pretty much got what he wanted.
Especially when it came to the opposite sex.
Michael had multiple girlfriends.
Michael had his pick of girls at school and played the field to his advantage. But that all changed when he met Sherry.
Sherry was this nice girl, and she went to high school with Michael.
She was quiet, kind of shy, very sweet, very good, kind-hearted person.
Sherry's quiet, vulnerable personality awakened a protective instinct in Michael. He and Sherry became inseparable.
They began living together, and eventually they got married.
In 1988, after nearly a decade together, Sherry gave birth to a son, and 2 years later, she and Michael welcomed a second son. With 2 hungry mouths to feed, Michael got on the management track at the local supermarket in order to help support his growing family.
By all outward appearances, the perfect suburban-style life.
But maintaining that perfect SoCal status proved expensive. With each passing day, the couple struggled to get by.
The Dalys were always just living from paycheck to paycheck.
A daily grind and pressure of being the family's sole provider began to get the best of Michael. And despite his job and responsibilities, inside Michael was the same boy for whom everything had come so easily. Increasingly, Michael fantasized about a riskier, edgier, more gratifying existence.
He wanted some danger, some excitement, something taboo.
Behind the facade was a man desperately seeking fantasy.
And fantasy was just what Michael found when Diana Hahn answered a supermarket job listing in December of 1993.
Michael hired Diana and thought she was quite attractive and flirted with her.
Diana enjoyed Michael's attention, but seeing how Michael was married, she didn't really expect their workplace flirtation to go anywhere.
He was a manager and was married and had 2 kids, so it didn't seem like a threat.
But through their superficial flirting, the co-workers found genuine common ground.
He and Diana shared the same ethnic background, as both of them were half Japanese.
They felt a bond because of their heritage.
There was this attraction. There was this chemistry.
And as their flirtation ramped up, they found it harder to ignore a deep, mutual physical desire. Within days of meeting, they gave in to temptation.
They start fooling around.
Before long, they were making out in the stockroom.
Workplace makeout sessions and stolen kisses paved the way to a deeper connection between the couple.
There was just this abject unhappiness and emptiness in both of their lives, and when they meet, it's, whoa, combustible.
They were having a very serious, romantic, physical relationship.
The couple continued to see each other secretly over the next 6 months. But it wasn't long before Diana grew sick of having to meet in secret, and Michael was tired of lying to his wife. And in the summer of 1995, he told Sherry that he was in love with his coworker and wanted to be with Diana 24/7.
He wants to move in with her. Michael goes to Sherry and basically says, you know, I need some time off. I need some time to myself. I need some time to think.
But Michael had no intention of spending that time alone. Michael immediately moved right into Diana's apartment. When not scorching the sheets in Diana's bedroom, the couple spent every night out on the town. 35-year-old Michael now had a second chance to live free from the responsibility of a marriage he found boring. In Michael's eyes, Diana finally saw the adoration she'd always craved. And in his hands, she found ecstasy.
They're just having lots of sex and partying it up.
But it wasn't long before the financial strain of supporting both his children and non-stop good times with his hot girlfriend stretched Michael's meager paychecks beyond their limits.
He's spending all his money on this affair. It's starting to build up and he's getting overwhelmed.
He wasn't going to be able to afford to pay child support to Sherry and set up a new life with Diana.
The mounting bills were a wake-up call, bringing him back to real life. Michael packed his suitcase and went back with his wife and children.
Michael moved back home. He had sort of seen the error of his ways living with Diana and wanted to come back to his children and to Sherry.
Diana was heartbroken. Being with Michael had made Diana feel wanted and desired. Now that he'd discarded her, she realized that the future she'd envisioned with Michael was just another in a long line of shattered dreams.
She would be feeling quite disappointed, lonely, sad that her dreams hadn't worked out.
Despite their powerful connection, Diana and Michael's passionate love affair had come to a halt. Sherry had her disgraced husband back, and Diana needed to move on. But Michael's reunion with his family would be short-lived. Soon he, Diana, and Sherry would be swept up into an investigation that would change their lives forever. Coming up, Michael's wife Sherry mysteriously vanishes.
Police find this minivan unlocked with the keys still in the ignition, and Sherry's not there and nowhere to be found.
But could Sherry's disappearance mean that Michael isn't the only one in their marriage with something to hide?
Apparently, the undercover cop arrested Sherry and took her away.
Sherry turned around, put her hands behind her back, and in fact was seen being handcuffed.
34-year-old Diana Hahn was a past-her-prime would-be model who'd been forced to take a job at a supermarket after her runway dreams died. But even in a hairnet, Diana could still turn heads. And it hadn't been long before she'd drawn the attention of her married boss, 35-year-old Michael Daly. What followed was a scorching workplace affair that spilled from the supermarket stockroom to Diana's bedroom.
It was getting hotter and hotter, and the next thing you know, they're in a full-blown, torrid affair.
So torrid that Michael moved out on his heartbroken wife, Sherry, and in with Diana. But just 5 months later, the two lovers found themselves at a fork in their rocky romantic path. Michael's live-for-today lifestyle with Diana had taken a toll on his finances. And it wasn't long before Michael realized that even if he wanted to make his separation from Sherry permanent with a divorce, he simply couldn't afford to.
Alimony, child support for 2 kids. I mean, he wasn't making bundles of money.
Broke and desperate, Michael begged Sherry to take him back. Divorcing Sherry wasn't an option, and Michael wanted to make their marriage work this time. Diana was heartbroken.
He came home because he wanted to be a part of the family again, and that he had sort of seen the error of his ways.
There were several times at work where Michael would talk about how he would never get a divorce.
Michael moved back in with his wife in the fall of 1995. But it didn't take long for Michael's marriage to be in trouble again. It began on the morning of May 6, 1996, when Sherry Daly went out for a morning of running errands and never returned. Michael grew increasingly concerned as the hours ticked by with no word from his wife. Later that evening, the worried husband placed a call to police.
Michael calls the police and says, "I think my wife is missing."
Local police explained to Michael that they wouldn't be able to help just yet.
And the cops are basically like, well, you know, it takes 72 hours for someone to be missing.
Undeterred, Michael wasted no time enlisting friends and family to look for his missing wife. And it wasn't long before one of the Daly's friends made a disturbing discovery in the parking lot of a nearby store.
Sherry's van is sitting in the parking lot. Sherry's not there and nowhere to be found.
Finding Sherry's vehicle with no sign of Sherry was enough to prompt police to officially open an investigation. They began by examining the van's interior and soon found several more alarming discoveries.
They noticed in Sherry's car that the keys are in the ignition and her ID is on the seat and her purchases are in the back seat.
But where was Sherry and what had happened to her? When police canvassed shoppers and store employees, witnesses described a woman fitting Sherry's description leaving the store earlier that morning. But as Sherry went to her van, the eyewitnesses said a second woman suddenly approached her.
There was a woman with blonde hair that went over to Sherry. There was a short conversation. Sherry turned around, put her hands behind her back, and in fact was seen being handcuffed.
Bystanders described seeing the blonde cop place a handcuffed Sherry in the back seat of her own unmarked car and then driving out of the parking lot.
Apparently, the undercover cop arrested Sherry and took her away.
Investigators wondered, what infraction could Sherry have possibly committed that led to her arrest by an undercover cop in a store parking lot? Eager to find out, detectives called into police headquarters to check the recent arrest logs. But they soon made a shocking discovery.
There was no record of it. No one knew about an arrest that was made.
Detectives were alarmed. It seemed that Sherry hadn't been arrested, but kidnapped by someone impersonating a police officer. News of the abduction sent shockwaves through the community. Meanwhile, Sherry's husband, Michael, did everything he could to help with the search.
He even calls the news and says, "Help me find my wife."
She wouldn't get into a car. She'd get into the back seat. Somebody she didn't know. She wouldn't leave her boys.
In the meantime, detectives began trying to unravel the tangled mess of facts and eyewitness accounts they had so far. Just what was behind Sherry's fake arrest?
Maybe this was a random abduction, a random kidnapping. Did this have to deal with Michael at all?
Or was Sherry a mom with secrets?
Maybe there's something else going on in her life.
But interviews with Sherry's friends and family quickly ended that speculation. The people that knew her best all agreed there was no hidden facet of Sherry's life that would lead to her abduction. But Sherry's friends also told police that the same couldn't be said for her husband, Michael.
He was cheating on his wife. Everyone knew that.
According to those who knew her, Sherry had been devastated by Michael's affair with his 34-year-old coworker, Diana. And when Michael ended the affair and moved back home, Sherry was determined to keep him. But close friends also told police that Sherry was blindsided by the revelation that Michael hadn't actually ended his workplace fling. In fact, he never intended to. And how did Sherry know? Because according to friends, Michael continued to flaunt his romance with Diana in Sherry's face, and in the strangest ways possible.
He gets this pillow made that has Diana's face on it and makes his wife sleep with it on their bed.
According to those in the know, both the pillow and the revelation that Michael was still seeing Diana enraged Sherry. and pushed her past the breaking point. But rather than take her frustrations out on her husband, Sherry had decided to confront Diana herself.
She confronted Diana at the market, and there was a yelling match going on out in the parking lot.
It was basically Sherry telling Diana to stay away from her and her husband and her family.
The revelation of Sherry and Diana's spat in the supermarket's parking lot was enough to make detectives wonder. Was it possible that Diana had decided to take care of Sherry before Sherry could make good on any of her threats? At first glance, it didn't seem likely. Physically, Diana was not a match to the kidnapper described by eyewitnesses.
They know that they're looking for a blonde.
Diana, on the other hand, was a petite brunette.
When investigators questioned Michael and Diana's co-workers, they learned Michael had been minding the store when Sherry went missing, just as he said. Diana, on the other hand, had taken the day off. But when investigators continued to question both Michael and Diana's co-workers, the shocked detectives learned that theirs hadn't been Michael's only extramarital affair. It seemed that Michael's wandering eye had even strayed past Diana.
He's kind of a womanizer and sleeps around with all sorts of women, including prostitutes.
Police were surprised, to say the least. The Michael Daly co-workers described to police was a far cry from the reformed husband and family man the public had seen on TV pleading for help.
Not only did Michael have a double life, he had a triple life. He had a wife, a mistress, and he had had other lovers.
Investigators had to wonder, could any of Michael's other adulterous affairs have put Sherry in harm's way? Had one of his jilted blonde girlfriends decided to eliminate his wife? And could his other lover, Diana, be the next on the list? Coming up, investigators take a closer look at Michael's extramarital activity and have an unexpectedly steamy encounter.
And they knock on her door, and she answers the door, and she's wearing lingerie.
And a grisly discovery turns the case on its head.
This is sending a message. Somebody was out to get her.
When police responded to a call from concerned husband Michael Dallin impersonating a cop and arresting Sherry, further investigation revealed Michael at the center of a love triangle, which also involved his workplace
Diana at the market, and there was a yelling match going on out in the parking lot.
When police interviewed Diana, they realized that the petite brunette didn't match the eyewitness description for a blonde perpetrator. And when they talked to other employees, they realized they needed to expand their suspect list, big time.
He was not only cheating on his wife, but also cheating on Diana.
Michael's a womanizer. He's a man whore. He's sleeping with multiple women.
Police wondered, had one of Michael's blonde girlfriends taken it on herself to settle a romantic score and hit Michael where it really hurt?
There were plenty of people who could have used Sherry as bait to get to Michael. A hooker who didn't get paid, a drug dealer who wanted money, perhaps loan sharks.
In order to put a face and name on their mystery woman, investigators took a closer look at the car witnesses saw a handcuffed Sherry driven away in, and a thorough search led them to a car rental agency. And when they compared the eyewitness description of the kidnapped vehicle to rental records, they caught a break and found a match.
It was discovered that there was this blue Nissan that had been rented.
The car had been rented the day before the abduction and returned the day after. When detectives asked where it was now, they were told it was right outside awaiting its next rental. Investigators wasted no time examining it. And when they searched the car's interior, they were shocked by what they found.
Upon inspection, it was discovered that there were blood stains in the back and on the floor.
It looked like somebody was trying to clean it off, but they missed a lot of spots.
Detectives collected blood samples, confident that they wouldn't have any downtime while they waited for results. The name on the rental papers meant that their next stop would be a familiar one.
Diana Hahn had rented this car in her own name.
Police made a beeline for Diana's apartment. And when the sexy counter girl opened her door,
They knock on her door, and she answers, and she's wearing lingerie.
detectives were surprised to see that she wasn't alone.
In the back of the apartment is Michael Daly, just hanging out in his boxers.
Officers escorted Diana and Michael to the station for questioning. Once there, Diana quickly offered up an explanation about the rental car.
She claims that her checkbook was stolen just before the crime happened.
She also told police that on the day of the kidnapping, she was nowhere near the crime scene.
She has an absolute alibi. She went on a long bike ride from the city of Ventura, miles away, to an area called Point Jaime. That's a long ride. That would take the day.
She even offered physical proof. A minor bike crash on the trail had left its mark.
She has some significant scratches on her forehead.
Diana had plenty of answers for all their questions, but investigators observed that the would-be model was running out of poise.
But they do notice that she's a little bit shaky. She's slightly distraught, a little bit emotional, and she wants to see Michael.
Meanwhile, lab tests of the blood samples found in the car revealed a match for Sherry Daly. But that didn't prove Diana killed her, or even that Sherry was dead. Police held Diana under suspicion for as long as they could, but eventually they were forced to release her.
We needed to wait until we had more evidence.
With the missing mother of two still out there somewhere, frustrated police had to admit that the blood traces they'd found just weren't enough. They needed to find Sherry, dead or alive, and secure evidence that would conclusively link Diana to her abduction. At the same time, police resolved not to give up the cause. Volunteer search parties continued to search every accessible inch of the town Sherry called home.
They, for weeks on end, were searching, hoping to find her.
Then, on June 1st, police got word that two of the searchers had made a shocking discovery.
A body is found.
Investigators examined the nearly skeletal remains. The body's condition couldn't hide what appeared to be a dense cluster of stab wounds in the chest, or mask the fact that the victim had been nearly decapitated.
Her remains were in an absolutely horrific and repulsive state. It was pretty upsetting to even the most seasoned police investigators.
Fast-tracked tissue samples told police the awful truth. The search for missing mom Sherry Daly was over.
They were able to identify that this was Sherry Daly.
The medical examiner confirmed the stab wounds.
Multiple stab wounds in the bone, in the chest area, as many as 14 penetrating stab wounds.
And after a closer look at Sherry's neck wounds, even seasoned homicide detectives struggled to understand the mindset behind this brutal crime. Sherry's head had been nearly severed from her body with an axe.
To stab someone repeatedly and to bludgeon them with apparently an axe is sending a message. Somebody was out to get her.
But who? Police wondered, had Diana killed Sherry in a fit of jealous rage? And if so, how were they going to prove it? Coming up, a surprise witness offers new evidence proving that sometimes when it comes to murder, it takes two.
Michael is the guy who's giving her instructions from A to Z on how to off his wife.
For 2 years, wannabe model Diana Hahn and married dad Michael Daly had been on-again, off-again lovers.
Diana Hahn was obsessed with Michael.
Michael had this very special love with Diana.
Their workplace flirtation turned into a hot and heavy romance. Michael even moved out on his wife Sherry in order to be with Diana 24/7.
He's having this big hot fling with Diana.
But economic realities and a guilty conscience sent Michael back home to his wife with his tail between his legs. When the unthinkable happened and Sherry was abducted, Michael led the civilian charge to find his wife.
He even calls the news and says, "Help me find my wife."
But over the course of the investigation into Sherry's puzzling disappearance, police learned that the father of two wasn't just cheating on Sherry, he was also cheating on Diana.
Once Diana Hahn realizes that Michael has been two-timing her, running around with prostitutes.
An eyewitness description of the kidnapped vehicle led detectives to a car with traces of blood in it, rented in Diana's name. When police paid a call on Diana about the car, they made another surprising discovery. Michael's widely wandering eye didn't seem to bother his mistress one bit.
After Sherry was missing, when the police went over there, she answered the door in her nightie, and Michael was standing behind her in his underwear.
Police questioned Diana about the vehicle, but she insisted that her checkbook had been stolen and someone else must have rented the car using her name. She also said she'd been miles away on a bike ride when Sherry was abducted. A minor injury she sustained during the ride was proof.
She has some significant scratches on her forehead.
Then, in a remote woods, volunteer searchers unearthed a badly decomposed corpse. The medical examiner had confirmed that it was Sherry and that she died of very unnatural causes. Multiple stab wounds and a series of axe blows to the neck that left her nearly decapitated.
Once Sherry Dolly's body is found, horrifically hacked up and mutilated, there's no question this is murder.
In an effort to trace the stolen checkbook to whomever had last used it, police looked at the other purchases it was used for in the days leading up to the murder.
We got search warrants for Diana Hahn's bank records.
In the last few days before Sherry's abduction, checks from Diana's account had been written to local department stores.
So they went to the stores and they were able to pull the register tapes and tell the detectives exactly what she had purchased.
When detectives looked at the purchased items, it was an ingredients list in a recipe for murder.
She had written a check for a blonde wig. She had written a check for an axe.
Despite Diana's insistence that her checks were stolen, the signatures on each one matched what the bank had on file for her.
It was her trademark signature.
For investigators, it was a slam dunk. They had purchase records for a getaway car, a murder weapon, and a disguise.
She was trying to disguise herself.
On August 1st, investigators again placed Diana Hahn into custody. But this time, she was under arrest for murder. Despite hours of grueling police interrogation, Diana stuck by her story.
Diana's alibi for the day of the killing was that she had gone on a long bike ride that day.
Then, a surprising witness showed up at the police station with rock-solid proof that Diana wasn't the only one who might have blood on her hands.
This woman named Sally approaches the police and actually tells them this very detailed story.
40-year-old Sally told police that before Michael met Diana, she had been in a 3-year affair with the father of two. During that time, Michael made it very clear to Sally that he was not happy about his marriage. And Sally said Michael always laid all of the blame on Sherry.
He would tell her how much he despised his wife. He wanted her just to, quote-unquote, disappear.
According to Sally, as time went on, Michael became very specific about what he meant by disappear.
I want her to die. I want her to suffer.
And he even suggested that Sally might be the one to make that happen.
He wanted Sally to kill Sherry. He wanted her to be stabbed, and he wanted her to be thrown off of a cliff.
Sally told police that they broke up before she was sure just how serious Michael was. But when she heard about the discovery of Sherry's body, she had to come forward.
She thinks to herself, I need to be calling the police because this very man suggested to me that I kill his wife. What is the first thing that Sally does? She contacts police.
Police were stunned. Had Michael scouted and recruited Diana to do his dirty work? Was he the mastermind behind the elaborate kidnapping and brutal murder? Investigators needed a solid connection to prove the two-person conspiracy theory. Their search began with Michael and Diana's phone records. Right away, they hit the jackpot.
What they realized is at the time of the abduction, there were many, many phone calls and communications between Michael and Diana.
To police, that indicated one thing.
Michael is the guy who's giving her instructions from A to Z on how to off his wife.
A further record search put the icing on the cake.
Just days after his wife goes missing, he files for a separation.
And bank statements revealed that Michael had already made financial plans for a future without Sherry in it.
Michael actually looks into her retirement funds and wants to cash in on all this money.
Police now believed that while Diana may have been Sherry Dowley's killer, Sherry's husband Michael was the one behind it all. On November 15th, police arrested Michael Dowley and charged him with first-degree murder and kidnapping.
It's clear that he masterminded it, and it's clear that he convinced her to do the dirty deed.
But while police were convinced of the couple's guilt, would a jury agree? And how much longer would Diana and Michael remain silent about the crime and loyal to each other? At Diana's trial, prosecutors walked the jury through what they believed happened the day Sherry disappeared.
This was an act of rage. This was an act of vengeance. This was a horrific murder.
Diana, clad in her blonde wig and tan suit, confronted Sherry in the parking lot where Michael told her she would find his wife. The counterfeit cop gave Michael's illegal activities as her reason for arresting Sherry.
We have your children. We found drugs in your house.
Terrified and confused and unable to see through Diana's disguise, Sherry complied.
Diana Hahn placed handcuffs on her, opened the rear door, put her hand on Sherry's head, and put her into the back seat.
Diana parked in a remote wooded area, pulled a knife, and viciously attacked the shocked mom. Handcuffed and strapped into her seat by the safety belt, Sherry had no way to defend herself.
While Sherry is trapped, she begins stabbing her repeatedly, over and over again.
But as Diana dragged her rival to the ground, she realized to her horror that Sherry was still alive and kicking.
Sherry still has some life in her and wants to fight back.
Coming up, shocking testimony as love and hate go on trial.
She just went buck wild with an axe.
But can the jury reach a verdict in an ugly game of he said, she said?
He was saying that Diana was just a psycho-jealous girlfriend.
She says it has to have been Michael that stole my checkbook.
Ventura, California, 1997. Sexy countergirl Diana Hahn and her married lover and boss, Michael Dowley, have been charged with murder and kidnapping in the brutal 1996 death of Michael's wife, Sherry. Prosecutors at Diana's trial laid out the murder in painstaking detail. Diana thought she had successfully abducted and murdered Michael's wife, Sherry, until Sherry, bleeding from multiple stab wounds, attacked her. Then, Diana took drastic measures to make sure that Sherry was going to keep still. Forever.
She just went buck wild with an axe and severed Sherry's head.
Diana's defense strategy was to stick to the story Diana had given police from the start.
Diana's defense was that she had nothing to do with the murder and that her checkbook was stolen.
And in a shocking turn, Diana's legal team offered up a new theory about just who had stolen the checkbook from Diana.
She says it has to have been Michael that stole my checkbook.
According to Diana's defense team, Michael had recruited yet another one of his bevy of secret lovers to kill his wife, frame Diana, and get away scot-free.
It was some prostitute that Mike had put up to it.
But would the jury believe that Diana was a victim? After 4.5 days of deliberations, the jury announced their verdict.
We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find Diana J. Hahn guilty of willful, deliberate, premeditated murder.
While the jury didn't buy Diana's story, she did receive a break during sentencing.
Diana Hahn was eligible to get the death penalty. The jury did not give it to her. She was given a life sentence instead.
Not long after, Michael Daly faced his day in court.
The real issue is, what was his involvement in the murder? And did he plan the murder, or was he the mastermind behind it?
Prosecutors alleged that Michael was just as responsible for Sherry's death as Diana. The fact that Michael wanted his wife dead was well documented in court by a string of witnesses.
This man hated his wife. This man told people, I wouldn't divorce her, I would kill her.
Using the phone records, prosecutors once again took the jury through each step of the murder, only with Michael guiding Diana through the plan.
She and Michael had been in contact by phone many times throughout the day, checking in with each other.
Michael's defense team insisted that Diana had acted alone.
The defense attorney in Michael's case was saying that Diana was just psycho-jealous girlfriend.
But the jury disagreed. Michael was found guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. Like Diana, he too was sentenced to life in prison. Two people that were so turned on by each other that they could rationalize murder had in the end turned on each other in court.
Diana and Michael really threw each other under the bus and blamed one another for everything.
The aspiring model and the unhappy hard-partying dad had cast themselves as fantasy figures in a bright future. Now, they were stuck with the sad reality of who they really were.
You have a bad guy who's a lot worse guy than anybody really realizes. And you have a bad girl who's a lot crazier than anybody realizes.
On the afternoon of March 21st, 2005, Red Lake, Minnesota, was not expecting to become the scene of one of the deadliest school shootings in the United States that year. Red Lake was a relatively isolated Ojibwe community in northern Minnesota, a place where family relationships and community connections ran deep. Red Lake High School was home to roughly 300 students. It had security measures in place, surveillance cameras, fencing, screening at the entrance, and a security guard. For the students and staff inside that building, the school was supposed to be a familiar place, structured around classes, conversations, routines, and the ordinary rhythm of a school day. But on that Monday afternoon, that sense of ordinary life would disappear within minutes. What makes the Red Lake case particularly disturbing is that the violence did not begin at the school. Before anyone inside the high school understood that something was wrong, two people had already been killed at a nearby home. The person responsible was 16-year-old Jeffrey James Weiss, a student who had attended Red Lake High School. By the time he arrived at the school, the events that would follow were already in motion. The sequence began at the home of Weiss's grandfather, Darrell Lucier, a Red Lake police officer. Weiss killed Lucier and also killed Michelle Sigana, Lucier's partner. Then, rather than fleeing, Weiss took his grandfather's police equipment, including firearms and body armor, and used his grandfather's police vehicle to travel to Red Lake High School. According to the FBI, he was carrying a shotgun and 2 handguns. That decision transformed a family killing into something much larger, and within a short period of time, the school itself would become the center of the tragedy. At approximately 2:49 p.m., Weiss arrived at Red Lake High School in the police vehicle. He was wearing a dark coat and carrying weapons. At the entrance, security guard Derek Brunn, 28 years old, saw him approaching and recognized that something was wrong. A warning was issued. Brunn moved toward the entrance, but Weiss shot him there. The attack had now entered the school. For the students inside, the first moments were defined by uncertainty. Some heard sounds but did not immediately understand what they meant. Others had no clear idea where the danger was or what was happening elsewhere in the building. In situations like this, information is often fragmented. One person hears something, another sees people running, someone else locks a classroom door. The people inside do not have the complete picture that investigators will later reconstruct. They only have the few seconds directly in front of them. After entering the school, Weiss continued the attack. A teacher, Neva Wincop Rogers, was with a group of students in the hallway. When the shooting began, they ran into a classroom and attempted to close the door. They were trying to create the simplest barrier possible between themselves and the danger outside. But Weiss reached the room. Rogers and 5 students were killed. Elsewhere in the school, other students tried to escape the immediate danger. Some ran away from the area. Others locked themselves inside classrooms. Witness accounts described Weiss shooting at doors or attempting to reach rooms where students had taken shelter. The people inside did not know how long the attack would last, where Weiss would go next, or whether the locked doors would protect them. Among those caught in the attack was 15-year-old Cody Thunder, who was in a biology classroom. Thunder heard the sounds and looked toward the hallway. He saw Weiss on the other side of a glass window. At first, Thunder could not believe that the weapon was real. He thought it might be a paintball gun or that Weiss might somehow be joking. Then Weiss fired. Thunder was shot in the hip, but he managed to reach a place of shelter. A bullet remained in his body afterward. Another student, Jeffrey May, was also seriously wounded. According to his family, May attempted to resist Weiss with a pencil before he was shot. These moments are important because they reveal how differently the same few minutes could be, experienced by different people. There was no single perspective inside the school. Some students were running. Some were hiding. Some were wounded. Some were trying to understand whether what they were hearing was actually gunfire. And some never had the opportunity to leave. At approximately 2:55 p.m., 911 calls began coming in. Police officers arrived at the school only minutes after the attack had begun. Weiss confronted officers inside the building, and a gunfight followed. According to the FBI, Weiss was struck multiple times by police gunfire. He then retreated to the classroom where most of the victims of the school attack had been killed. Around 2:58 p.m., only about 9 minutes after his arrival at the school, Weiss died by suicide. In that extraordinarily short period, the sequence of violence had moved from a private home to a school filled with students and staff, leaving 9 victims dead and 6 people injured at the school according to the FBI's active shooter record. Including Weiss, 10 people died during the overall incident. The victims were Daryl Lucier, Michelle Sigana, Derek Brunn, Neva Wincop Rogers, and 5 students whose lives ended inside the school. Weiss's death also meant that there would never be a criminal trial in which he could be questioned about what he had done. There would be no courtroom testimony from him, no cross-examination, and no jury verdict that might provide a definitive explanation for his motives. Investigators could reconstruct what happened. They could establish the sequence of events, identify the victims, examine Weiss's background, and consider the material he had posted online. But the central question remained difficult. Why? Weiss was 16 years old. People who knew him had described him as isolated and quiet, and he had developed a Gothic image. He had experienced serious family difficulties. His father had died by suicide, while his mother was receiving long-term care after an accident. Before the shooting, Weiss had also been placed in a homebound education program following a disciplinary problem at school. He had used websites and forums containing extremist material and had posted dark content. These facts became important after the massacre because investigators and the public naturally searched backward, looking for signs that might explain what was coming. But there is a difference between identifying troubling circumstances and proving a motive. The available information does not establish that any one of these factors caused the massacre, nor does it show that Weiss selected all of his victims because of personal hatred. The evidence instead points to a much more unsettling uncertainty. The people killed inside Red Lake High School were largely students and staff who happened to be there when the attack occurred. The tragedy cannot be reduced to a simple story about one grievance or one target. There was also no confirmed evidence that Weiss carried out the school shooting as part of a larger group. Another teenager, Louis Jourdain, became involved in a separate investigation after the massacre concerning threats and alleged plans. Jourdain eventually admitted to a charge involving threatening interstate communications, while more serious charges, including conspiracy to commit murder, were dropped. His case was handled through the juvenile justice system, but his involvement did not establish that he was an accomplice in the Red Lake shooting. Investigators, including the FBI, believed Weiss appeared to have acted alone. And so the story of Red Lake begins not with a clear motive, but with a sequence of events that unfolded with terrifying speed. A 16-year-old entered his grandfather's home. 2 people were killed. Police equipment was taken. A police vehicle crossed the distance to a high school. At 2:49 p.m., a security guard saw something wrong. Minutes later, students were hiding behind classroom doors. A teacher and 5 students were dead. Others were wounded, and police were exchanging gunfire with the attacker. By 2:58 p.m., the shooting was over. But the end of the gunfire was not the end of the tragedy. For the families of the 9 victims, the lives that existed before that afternoon were gone forever. For the students who survived, the school itself had become connected to an experience that could not simply be erased. And for the Red Lake community, a place bound together by family and shared history was left to confront a loss that extended far beyond the walls of the high school. In the hours and days that followed, investigators would begin reconstructing the sequence. They would examine Weiss's background, his actions, the events at his grandfather's home, his movements to the school, the response of law enforcement, and the unanswered question of motive. But before those questions could be addressed, there was a more immediate reality. 9 people had been killed, 6 others had been injured at the school, and an entire community had been forced to understand that a few minutes on an ordinary Monday afternoon had changed Red Lake forever. To understand what happened at Red Lake High School on March 21, 2005, it is necessary to begin before the shooting, before the police vehicle appeared outside the school, and before the first emergency calls reached authorities. Red Lake was not simply a location on a map. It was a relatively isolated Ojibwe community in northern Minnesota, within the Red Lake Reservation, where families and relationships formed a closely connected social environment. The school was part of that community. Red Lake High School served roughly 300 students, many of whom knew one another not only as classmates but through family and community connections. That closeness would make the events of March 21st particularly devastating. The people affected were not distant strangers brought together by chance. They belonged to a community where the consequences of violence could spread quickly from one household to another. Before the shooting, Red Lake High School already had measures intended to provide security. There were surveillance cameras, fencing, screening at the entrance, and a security guard. Those precautions are important because they demonstrate that the school was not completely unaware of the possibility of danger. Yet security measures are designed around the information available at a particular moment. On that afternoon, the danger did not announce itself as a conventional threat approaching the school. It came in a police vehicle taken from a murdered officer, driven by a 16-year-old student who had already killed 2 people. By the time that danger reached the school, there was very little time for anyone inside to understand what was happening. One of the people whose job was to protect the school was Derek Brunn, a 28-year-old security guard. When Weiss approached the building, Brunn recognized that something was wrong. A warning was issued, and Brunn moved toward the entrance. He was shot there. His death marked the beginning of the attack inside the school and placed students and staff in immediate danger. The fact that Brunn reacted to the approaching threat is significant. He did not simply ignore what he saw, but recognition and response do not always produce enough time to prevent violence. The attack unfolded within minutes. As the shooting continued, students were forced to make decisions without knowing the full situation. Some ran, Others locked themselves inside classrooms. Some heard gunfire and shouting without knowing where the attacker was. The building, which had been organized around predictable routines, suddenly became a place where ordinary actions took on a different meaning. A classroom door was no longer simply an entrance. It could become a barrier. A hallway was no longer merely a route between classes. It could become a place of danger. And the people moving through those spaces had almost no reliable information about what would happen next. Among the staff members caught in the attack was Neva Wincop Rogers. According to the available account, Rogers was with a group of students in a hallway when the shooting began. They ran into a classroom and attempted to close the door. The instinct was simple: get inside, close the door, and create distance from the gunman. But Weiss reached the room. Rogers and 5 students were killed. Their deaths form one of the central tragedies of the case, not because of any particular motive that has been established, but because the available information does not show that these people were selected according to a clearly documented personal grievance. They were teachers and students inside a school when the attack reached them. That distinction matters. True crime narratives can sometimes become so focused on the perpetrator that the victims are reduced to numbers in a timeline. In Red Lake, the numbers tell only part of the story. 9 people were ultimately killed by Weiss. 2 were killed before he reached the school. 7 were killed at the school: Derek Brunn, Neva Wincop Rogers, and 5 students. 6 people were also injured at the school, according to the FBI's active shooter record. Behind those figures were families, relationships, and lives that ended or changed on a single afternoon. The available information does not provide a complete biography of every victim, and it would be wrong to invent one. What can be said with certainty is that each person was more than a line in an investigative report. The same is true of the students who survived. Their experiences reveal how quickly confusion can become fear. Cody Thunder, 15 years old, was in a biology classroom when he heard the sounds of the attack. He looked toward the hallway and saw Weiss on the other side of a glass window. Thunder initially struggled to believe that the weapon was real. He thought it might be a paintball gun or that Weiss could somehow be joking. Then the gun was fired. Thunder was shot in the hip but managed to reach a place of shelter. A bullet remained in his body afterward. Another student, Jeffrey May, was seriously wounded. According to his family, May attempted to resist Weiss with a pencil before being shot. These accounts illustrate one of the most difficult aspects of the Red Lake attack. The victims did not experience it with the knowledge that later investigators would possess. Investigators could eventually reconstruct the sequence of events. Survivors had only fragments: a sound, a figure in a hallway, a door closing, someone running, a wound, a decision made in a moment. That uncertainty is central to understanding what it was like inside the school. There was no single shared awareness of the attack. Different students and staff knew different things at different moments. Some may have understood immediately that there was a gunman. Others initially struggled to interpret what they were hearing. Some sought shelter, while others tried to escape. The attack moved faster than a complete picture could form. Away from the school, the background of the person responsible was already becoming relevant to investigators. Jeff Weiss was 16 years old and had attended Red Lake High School. People who knew him described him as isolated and quiet, and he was associated with a Gothic style. Before the shooting, he had been placed in a homebound education program after a disciplinary problem at school. His family history contained serious difficulties. His father had died by suicide, and his mother was receiving long-term care after an accident. These circumstances would later be examined as investigators attempted to understand how a 16-year-old could carry out such an attack. But they cannot be treated as a simple explanation. A troubled family history does not automatically lead to violence. Social isolation does not automatically lead to violence. A Gothic appearance does not automatically indicate violent intentions. Even disturbing material posted online cannot, by itself, explain the actions of a particular individual. Weiss had used websites and forums containing extremist material and had posted dark content. Those details became part of the retrospective examination of his life. After a tragedy, people naturally look backward. They search for warning signs, moments that might have been interpreted differently, or indications that the future could have been predicted. But hindsight can create a misleading sense of certainty. Knowing what someone eventually did can make earlier behavior appear more obviously connected than it may have seemed at the time. The available information does not establish one specific motive for Weiss's actions, nor does it establish that all of the victims at the school were personally selected by him. This is one of the most important facts to preserve when examining the case. It would be easy to construct a simple narrative in which a troubled teenager became angry at particular people and then acted on that anger. But the evidence provided does not support such a straightforward conclusion. Instead, the case contains a series of known circumstances and a central unanswered question. Investigators knew what Weiss did. They knew where the violence began. They knew how he reached the school. They knew how the attack ended. They could examine his background and his online activity, but they could not obtain a complete explanation from Weiss himself. He died at the scene, meaning there would be no criminal trial in which he could be questioned about his motives. For the Red Lake community, however, the absence of a definitive explanation did not make the consequences any less real. The school remained. The families remained. The students who survived remained. And the community had to confront something that cannot be measured simply by the number of victims. The loss of the ordinary sense of safety that had existed before March 21st. Red Lake High School had been a place where young people went to learn. On that afternoon, it became the center of a tragedy that reached far beyond its walls. To understand the case, it is therefore necessary to keep two perspectives in view at the same time. One is the investigation into Jeff Weiss and the circumstances surrounding his actions. The other is the experience of the people who had no part in creating the violence but were forced to endure it. The second perspective is the one that can easily disappear when a case becomes famous. In Red Lake, it is the one that should remain at the center. Before there was an investigation, before there were statistics, before there were questions about motive, there were people inside a school trying to survive an event they could not yet understand. And while investigators would later reconstruct those minutes step by step, for the people inside the building, those minutes were not history. They were happening in real time. The afternoon of March 21st, 2005, began moving toward tragedy before anyone at Red Lake High School knew there was a danger approaching. The school would later become the most visible location associated with the case. But the first deaths occurred somewhere else, at the home of Jeff Weiss's grandfather, Darrell Lucier. Lucier was not simply Weiss's grandfather. He was also a Red Lake police officer, a fact that would become critically important in the sequence that followed. The information available about the first part of the attack is limited compared with the later reconstruction of events at the school. What is known is that Weiss went to Lucier's home during the early afternoon. There, he killed his grandfather and Michelle Sagana, Lucier's partner. These two killings changed the nature of the afternoon before the school attack had even begun. At that point, Weiss had already committed a double homicide. But rather than leaving the area and disappearing, he took his grandfather's police equipment, including firearms and body armor, and used Lucier's police vehicle to travel to Red Lake High School. According to the FBI, he carried a shotgun and 2 handguns. The sequence is important because it shows that the shooting at the school was not an isolated event that suddenly appeared without warning. It was the second stage of a chain of violence that had already begun. The first victims were people connected to Weiss through family and personal relationships. The next victims would be people inside a school. Between those two locations was a short journey, but in terms of the investigation, that journey became a critical link. The police vehicle, the weapons, and the protective equipment all came from the first crime scene. By the time Weiss was traveling toward the school, the circumstances surrounding him had changed dramatically. He was no longer simply a 16-year-old student. He was carrying weapons and equipment taken from a police officer he had just killed, and he was heading toward a building occupied by hundreds of people. Yet the people inside Red Lake High School had no reason to know what had happened at Lucier's home. From their perspective, the school day was still unfolding. That separation in knowledge would become one of the defining characteristics of the tragedy. Weiss knew what had happened. The students and staff did not. Investigators would later be able to connect the two locations into one continuous timeline. But at the time, the people at the school could only react to what they could see and hear. The decision to use Lucier's police vehicle was particularly significant because it allowed Weiss to arrive at the school in a vehicle associated with law enforcement. The school already had security measures, including cameras, fencing, screening at the entrance, and a security guard. But those measures could not eliminate the danger once the attacker was already approaching with weapons and using a police vehicle taken from a murdered officer. The available information does not establish that Weiss's choice of vehicle was intended to deceive a particular person or defeat a particular security system. It is simply part of the known sequence. After killing Lucier and Sigana, he took the vehicle and police equipment and drove to the high school. The distinction matters because the temptation in a case like this is to turn every action into evidence of a carefully constructed plan. Some actions may have been deliberate, but the supplied information does not allow every intention to be known. What can be established is what happened. At approximately 2:49 p.m., Weiss arrived at Red Lake High School. The school had roughly 300 students. Inside were teachers, students, and staff members going about their normal responsibilities. The building was not completely without protection. There was a security guard, and there were existing security measures. Among the people responsible for security was 28-year-old Derek Brunn. When Brunn saw Weiss approaching the entrance, he recognized that something was wrong. A warning was issued, and Brunn moved toward the door. In those few moments, the situation changed from a potential security concern into an active attack. Weiss shot Brunn at the entrance. Brunn became the first person killed at the school. His death was also the point at which the violence that had begun at Lucier's home became visible to the school community. Weiss then entered the building. What happened next unfolded rapidly. The students and staff inside did not receive a detailed explanation of the threat. They did not have time to gather in one place and discuss what to do. They had to react individually or in small groups. Some heard the gunfire and began running. Others sought shelter in classrooms. Some locked doors in an attempt to create a barrier between themselves and the attacker. The attack moved through the school, while information moved much more slowly. This is an important distinction when reconstructing the event. From the perspective of an investigation, the sequence can eventually be arranged into a timeline. From the perspective of a student inside the building, the experience was fragmented. A person might hear a sound without knowing its source. They might see another student running without knowing why. They might close a classroom door without knowing whether the attacker was nearby. The people inside did not know what investigators would later know. They did not know that 2 people had already been killed at Lucier's home. They did not know that the person entering the school was the same person responsible for those deaths. And they did not know how quickly the attack would end. The first stage of the school attack therefore created a situation in which fear was combined with uncertainty. Students were not simply trying to escape a known threat. Many were trying to understand what the threat actually was. That uncertainty appears in the accounts of survivors who initially struggled to believe that the weapon they saw was real. 15-year-old Cody Thunder, for example, was in a biology classroom when he heard the sounds of the attack. When he looked toward the hallway and saw Weiss through a glass window, he initially thought the weapon might be a paintball gun or that Weiss could be joking. Only when Weiss fired did the reality become unmistakable. Thunder was wounded in the hip but managed to reach shelter. Another student, Jeffrey May, was seriously wounded after attempting to resist Weiss with a pencil. According to his family, These experiences would become part of the later reconstruction of the attack. But at the time, they were simply moments of survival. There was no opportunity for the students to step back and understand the larger picture. They were inside an unfolding crisis. Meanwhile, the people who had been killed at Lucier's home were already part of a separate crime scene. Investigators would have to reconstruct what happened there while also examining the events at the school. The relationship between the two locations was central to understanding the case. The first killings explained how Weiss obtained the police equipment and vehicle. The vehicle explained how he reached the school. His arrival explained how the school attack began. And the school attack eventually led to the confrontation with police that ended his life. One event flowed into the next. Yet even with that sequence established, the central question remained unresolved. Why did Weiss kill his grandfather and Michelle Sigana? Why did he then travel to the school? Why were those students and staff placed in his path? The available information does not provide a single definitive answer. His troubled background, family history, isolation, disciplinary problems, and online activity would all be examined afterward, but none can be treated as a complete explanation. There is also no evidence in the supplied information that the school victims were all personally selected targets. That uncertainty would become one of the most difficult aspects of the investigation. The first killings, therefore, cannot be understood merely as a prelude to the school shooting. They were the beginning of the tragedy itself. 2 lives were lost at Lucier's home, and the actions that followed created the conditions for the deaths that would occur at the high school. By the time Weiss drove away in the police vehicle, the afternoon had already crossed a line from ordinary life into irreversible violence. The students at Red Lake High School did not know that. They were still inside their classrooms, still moving through the building, still living in the last ordinary minutes before the attack reached them. And somewhere on the road between the two locations, the events at the house were becoming connected to the school. The next time the people inside Red Lake High School would see Jeff Weiss, he would no longer be approaching as a student returning to a familiar place. He would arrive carrying weapons, wearing equipment taken from a murdered police officer, and within minutes the first warning at the entrance would become the beginning of a massacre. At approximately 2:49 p.m. on March 21, 2005, Jeff Weiss arrived at Red Lake High School in a police vehicle that had belonged to his grandfather, Darrell Lucier. Only minutes earlier, 2 people had been killed at Lucier's home. Now the violence was moving toward a building occupied by approximately 300 students. From inside the school, there was no way for most people to understand what had already happened. They did not know that Weiss had killed his grandfather. They did not know that Michelle Sigana had also been killed. They did not know that Weiss had taken police equipment and weapons and was now approaching the school. They were simply students and staff inside a familiar place until the first signs of danger appeared. Red Lake High School had security measures in place. There were cameras, fencing, screening at the entrance, and a security guard. The presence of those measures is important because it shows that the school was not completely unprotected. But security depends on recognizing a threat in time to respond to it. And on March 21st, the person approaching the entrance was someone who had already crossed a line into lethal violence. Weiss was wearing a dark coat and carrying weapons. Among the people responsible for security at the school was 28-year-old Derek Brunn. When Brunn saw Weiss approaching, he recognized that something was wrong. A warning was issued. Brunn moved toward the entrance. Within moments, Weiss shot him. Brunn became the first victim inside the school. His death marked the transition between 2 connected stages of the same tragedy. The violence had begun at a private residence, but now it had entered a public space filled with young people. Weiss continued into the building. What followed unfolded so quickly that many of the students inside could not immediately understand what was happening. This is one of the most important aspects of the Red Lake attack. The people inside the school did not experience the event as a complete timeline. They experienced fragments, a sound, movement in a hallway, A person running, a door closing, someone shouting, the sound of gunfire. There was no single moment when every student suddenly understood the entire situation. Instead, awareness spread unevenly, and that uncertainty shaped the decisions people made. Some students tried to get away from the immediate area. Others locked themselves inside classrooms. The ordinary architecture of the school suddenly became a series of choices. A hallway could expose someone to danger. A classroom could offer shelter. A closed door could become the only barrier between a student and the attacker. But nobody knew how effective that barrier would be or how long they would need to remain behind it. Among those caught in the attack was teacher Neva Wincop Rogers. Rogers was with a group of students in a hallway when the shooting began. They ran into a classroom and attempted to close the door. It was a simple response to an extraordinary situation: get inside, shut the door, and try to keep the danger outside. But Weiss reached the room. Rogers and 5 students were killed. Their deaths represented the central tragedy of the attack. They were inside a school, in a classroom, surrounded by the familiar routines of education. When those routines were violently interrupted, the available information does not establish that these particular victims were chosen because of a documented personal grievance. That distinction is important. There is a tendency, when examining a crime after the fact, to search for a clear list of targets and a clear explanation for why each person was attacked. But the evidence provided does not support that kind of simple conclusion. The school victims were primarily students and staff who were present when Weiss entered the building. Elsewhere in the school, other students were attempting to survive. Some ran, others hid. Some locked themselves inside rooms. Witnesses described Weiss shooting at doors or trying to reach areas where students had taken shelter. For those hiding inside classrooms, the danger was not something they could see continuously. They had to interpret what they heard. A sound in the hallway could mean that Weiss was moving closer, or it could mean he was moving away. A locked door could provide protection, but there was no certainty that it would remain secure. And the students had no way of knowing when police would arrive or how long the attack would continue. The experience of 15-year-old Cody Thunder illustrates that uncertainty. Thunder was in a biology classroom when he heard the sounds coming from the attack. He looked toward the hallway and saw Weiss on the other side of a glass window. At first, Thunder did not believe the weapon was real. He thought it could be a paintball gun or that Weiss might somehow be joking. Then Weiss fired. Thunder was shot in the hip. Despite being wounded, he managed to reach a place of shelter. A bullet remained in his body afterward. In the middle of the attack, there was no opportunity to understand the larger story. Thunder could not know what had happened at Lucier's home. He could not know how Weiss had obtained the weapons. He could not know that the person in the hallway had already killed 2 people before arriving at the school. He could only respond to what was immediately in front of him. Another student, Jeffrey May, was also seriously wounded. According to his family, May attempted to resist Weiss with a pencil before being shot. His actions, like Thunder's survival, were shaped by the circumstances of a few seconds. They were not decisions made with the benefit of time or information. They were reactions to an immediate threat. These survivor accounts also demonstrate why the sequence of the shooting should not be described simply as a list of names and numbers. The attack consisted of hundreds of individual moments, each experienced by someone who did not know how the larger event would end. For some, the most important decision was whether to run. For others, it was whether to remain hidden. For others, it was simply finding somewhere to go after being wounded. The school itself became divided into different zones of experience. In one area, students were trying to escape. In another, people were hiding. Elsewhere, the attacker was moving through the building. The available information does not provide every movement inside the school, and it would be inappropriate to invent a precise sequence for moments that are not documented in the supplied material. What can be established is that Weiss moved through the school, firing at people and attempting to reach areas where students had taken shelter. The violence continued for only a short period, but its consequences were permanent. Derek Brunn was dead at the entrance. Neva Wincop Rogers and 5 students were dead inside the school. Other students had been wounded. According to the FBI's active shooter record, 6 people were injured at the school. The number of people affected, however, was much greater than the official count of dead and wounded. Every student who witnessed the attack, every teacher who experienced those minutes, and every family waiting for information would carry the consequences beyond the moment when the shooting stopped. Meanwhile, emergency calls were beginning to reach authorities. At approximately 2:55 p.m., 911 calls began coming in. Police officers responded to the school, but by then the attack had already taken place inside the building. The arrival of law enforcement would create the final confrontation between Weiss and the police. That confrontation would occur only minutes after the first shots were fired at the entrance. The speed of the response and the short duration of the attack are essential to understanding what happened next. From the arrival of Weiss at approximately 2:49 p.m. to his death around 2:58 p.m., only about 9 minutes passed. In those 9 minutes, a security guard was killed, a teacher and 5 students were killed, other students were wounded, and the school was transformed from a place of learning into the center of an unfolding emergency. Yet for the people inside, those 9 minutes could not have felt short. Time during a crisis is experienced differently. A few seconds can become a series of decisions. A locked door can seem like the only protection available. A hallway can become something to fear. And a sound that initially seems confusing can suddenly become unmistakable. The attack at Red Lake High School was therefore not simply a sequence of gunshots recorded on a timeline. It was a collection of human experiences taking place simultaneously, with students and staff forced to react without knowing the full circumstances surrounding them. By the time police entered the situation, the worst of the attack had already happened. But Weiss was still alive, still armed, and still inside the school. The final minutes would bring the first direct confrontation between the attacker and law enforcement. And while the students who remained hidden waited for the danger to end, the investigation that would follow had already begun in another sense. Every surviving witness, every victim, and every movement through the school would eventually become part of an effort to reconstruct what had happened during those few minutes after 2:49 p.m. By the time the first emergency calls began reaching authorities at approximately 2:55 p.m., the situation inside Red Lake High School had already become a struggle for survival. The attack had begun only minutes earlier, but within that short period Derek Brunn had been killed at the entrance. Neva Wincop Rogers and 5 students had been killed inside the school, and other students had been wounded. For the people still alive inside the building, however, the full scale of what had happened was not yet clear. They were experiencing the event from separate rooms, hallways, and hiding places. Some were trying to escape. Others were attempting to remain unseen. Many did not know where Jeff Weiss was or how long the danger would continue. The uncertainty was as significant as the gunfire itself. One of the clearest accounts of those moments comes from 15-year-old Cody Thunder. Thunder was in a biology classroom when he heard the sounds coming from the attack. Like many people caught unexpectedly in an emergency, he initially had difficulty interpreting what he was seeing. When he looked toward the hallway, he saw Weiss on the other side of a glass window. Thunder did not immediately believe that the weapon was real. He thought it might be a paintball gun, or that Weiss might somehow be joking. That uncertainty lasted only until Weiss fired. The moment the weapon was used, the situation became unmistakable. Thunder was shot in the hip. Despite being wounded, he managed to reach a place of shelter. A bullet remained in his body afterward. His experience illustrates how quickly an ordinary school environment could become a place of danger. There had been no time for him to receive a complete warning explaining who the attacker was, where he had come from, or what he intended to do. He had only what he could see in front of him and the few seconds available to react. Another student, Jeffrey May, was also seriously wounded. According to his family, May attempted to resist Weiss with a pencil before he was shot. The detail is striking not because it turns May into a larger-than-life figure, but because it shows how limited the choices could become when a student suddenly confronted a lethal threat. There was no preparation for such a moment. There was simply an immediate decision to make. The experiences of Thunder and May also help explain why the events inside Red Lake High School cannot be understood only through a chronological list of deaths and injuries. The official timeline can tell us when the police arrived, when the shooting ended, and how many people were killed or injured. It cannot fully describe what it meant for a student to hear gunfire and not know whether the person holding the weapon was nearby. It cannot measure the fear of a person hiding behind a closed classroom door. It cannot capture the uncertainty of someone who sees another student running but does not know what that student has seen. Those experiences existed alongside the physical facts of the investigation. Other students reacted in different ways. Some tried to move away from the danger. Others locked themselves inside classrooms. Witnesses described Weiss shooting at doors or attempting to reach places where students had taken shelter. The people hiding inside those rooms had no way of knowing whether the attacker would continue moving through the school or whether law enforcement would arrive before he reached them. A locked door could provide a sense of protection, but it could not provide certainty. The available information does not document every decision made by every student, and it is important not to invent conversations or reactions that were never recorded. What can be established is that the students responded to the immediate threat in whatever ways were available to them: running, hiding, locking doors, and in some cases attempting to resist. Meanwhile, the emergency response was beginning outside the school. At approximately 2:55 p.m., 911 calls began coming in. The calls alerted authorities that something serious was happening at Red Lake High School. Police officers responded and entered the situation only minutes after the attack began. Their arrival created a new stage in the incident. Until that point, Weiss had been moving through the school with students and staff attempting to survive around him. Now armed officers were approaching him. According to the FBI, Weiss confronted police officers inside the building, and a gunfight followed. During the exchange, Weiss was struck multiple times by police gunfire. The confrontation did not immediately end the situation. After being hit, Weiss retreated toward the classroom where most of the victims of the school attack had been killed. The movement brought the violence back toward one of the locations where the greatest loss of life had already occurred. For the students and staff who remained elsewhere in the building, the arrival of police would have marked a crucial change. But the information available does not provide a complete account of what every survivor knew at that exact moment. That limitation is important. Later investigators could establish that police had confronted Weiss and that the gunman ultimately withdrew to a classroom. Survivors experienced the event without that later knowledge. Their understanding was necessarily incomplete. They had to rely on whatever sounds and information reached them. The entire attack at the school lasted only a matter of minutes. One source cited investigators as placing Weiss's arrival at approximately 2:49 p.m. and his suicide at approximately 2:58 p.m. That means the central period of the school shooting lasted roughly 9 minutes. 9 minutes is a small measurement of time, but it contained an enormous number of consequences. In those minutes, lives were lost, people were wounded, students were forced to hide or flee. Emergency calls were made, and police officers entered the school to confront the attacker. Eventually, Weiss retreated to the classroom where the majority of the school victims had been killed. He then died by suicide, shooting himself in the head. The shooting was over. But for the people who had survived, the end of the attack did not mean an immediate return to normal life. The immediate danger had ended, but the experience itself could not simply be erased. For Cody Thunder, there was a physical reminder in the form of the bullet that remained in his body. For Jeffrey May, the injuries were part of a story that would remain with him and his family. For the other survivors, the consequences were not necessarily visible in the same way. They had experienced an armed attack inside a place that was supposed to be familiar and controlled. The school had contained cameras, fencing, screening, and a security guard, yet a deadly attack had still occurred. That fact would inevitably become part of the later discussion about school security and emergency response. But the existence of security measures should not obscure the immediate human reality. Derek Brunn had attempted to respond when he recognized the danger. Students had attempted to find shelter. Emergency calls had been made. Police officers had responded. Yet the attack had moved faster than the ability of most people inside the building to fully understand it. When investigators later reconstructed the incident, the timeline would appear relatively clear. At approximately 2:49 p.m., Weiss arrived. Brunn was killed at the entrance. Weiss entered the school. Rogers and 5 students were killed. Other students were wounded or sought shelter. At approximately 2:55 p.m., 911 calls began. Police arrived and confronted Weiss. He was struck by police gunfire, retreated to a classroom, and died by suicide around 2:58 p.m. But behind that timeline were dozens of individual experiences that could never be reduced to the same few numbers. Some people were killed before they could escape. Some survived because they found shelter. Some were wounded and managed to keep moving. Some witnessed events that would remain part of their memories long after the school had reopened. And some families would receive news that no family should ever have to receive. The fact that Weiss died before he could be taken into custody would also shape everything that followed. There would be no interrogation of the 16-year-old attacker after the shooting. There would be no criminal trial in which prosecutors could present the evidence against him and ask him to explain his actions. Investigators would instead have to reconstruct the case through the physical and testimonial evidence available to them, while survivors and witnesses would carry the human memory of those 9 minutes. The end of the shooting, therefore, marked the beginning of another process. Police had stopped the immediate threat, but now they had to determine exactly what had happened, beginning with the events at Lucier's home and continuing through Weiss's arrival at the school. They would need to understand how the two locations were connected, establish the sequence of the killings, examine Weiss's background, and consider whether anyone else had known about or assisted in his actions. Most importantly, they would confront the question that would remain difficult even after the timeline was reconstructed. What had driven a 16-year-old to commit the killings in the first place? The answer would not be found in the final 9 minutes alone. It would require investigators to look backward, beyond the school, beyond the police confrontation, and beyond the day of the shooting itself. The survivors could tell investigators what they had experienced. The timeline could establish what happened, but neither could fully explain why. That unanswered question would become one of the central mysteries of the Red Lake case. Once the shooting at Red Lake High School had ended, the nature of the case changed. The immediate emergency was over, but investigators now faced the difficult task of reconstructing a sequence of events that had unfolded in only a matter of minutes. There were 2 connected locations to understand, multiple victims, surviving witnesses, and an attacker who was dead and therefore unable to explain his actions. The investigation had to begin with what could be established. What happened at Darryl-Lucier's home, how Jeff Weiss moved from that location to the school, what happened after he arrived, how law enforcement responded, and how the attack ended. The first part of that reconstruction concerned Lucier's home. Lucier was Weiss's grandfather and a Red Lake police officer. During the early afternoon of March 21st, Weiss went to the home and killed Lucier and Michelle Sagana, Lucier's partner. These 2 deaths were the beginning of the overall sequence. Investigators then had to connect those killings to what happened later at the high school. One of the most important links was the police equipment and vehicle. After killing Lucier and Sagana, Weiss took equipment belonging to his grandfather, including firearms and body armor, and used Lucier's police vehicle to travel to Red Lake High School. According to the FBI, he carried a shotgun and 2 handguns. This information established a clear physical connection between the first crime scene and the school. The vehicle was not simply a means of transportation. It was part of the chain of events that carried the violence from the home into the community's high school. At approximately 2:49 p.m., Weiss arrived at the school. Investigators could then reconstruct the second stage of the attack. Red Lake High School had approximately 300 students and already had security measures including surveillance cameras, fencing, screening at the entrance, and a security guard. Derek Brunn, 28, was working as the security guard when he saw Weiss approaching. Brunn recognized that something was wrong, and a warning was issued. Brunn moved toward the entrance and was shot. His death became the first confirmed killing inside the school. Weiss then entered the building, where the attack continued. A teacher, Neva Wincop Rogers, was with a group of students in a hallway. When the shooting began, they ran into a classroom and attempted to close the door. Weiss reached the room, and Rogers and 5 students were killed. Other students attempted to escape or hide. Some locked themselves inside classrooms. Witnesses described Weiss shooting at doors or attempting to reach rooms where students had taken shelter. The investigation, therefore, had to account for a rapidly changing situation in which different witnesses had seen different parts of the attack. No single student or staff member inside the building had the complete picture. Some people were wounded. Others survived by reaching shelter. 15-year-old Cody Thunder was in a biology classroom when he heard the sounds of the attack. He looked toward the hallway and saw Weiss through a glass window. Thunder initially did not believe the weapon was real and thought it might be a paintball gun or that Weiss might be joking. When Weiss fired, Thunder was shot in the hip but managed to reach shelter. A bullet remained in his body afterward. Another student, Jeffrey May, was seriously wounded. According to his family, May attempted to resist Weiss with a pencil before being shot. These accounts were important not because they provided a complete description of the attack, but because they represented individual fragments of it. Investigators could compare such accounts with the known timeline and with other information from the scene. But the available data does not provide a complete catalog of every piece of physical evidence collected at the school, and it would be misleading to invent forensic details that are not documented here. The most reliable reconstruction, therefore, remains centered on the established sequence of events. At approximately 2:55 p.m., 911 calls began coming in. Police officers arrived at the school and confronted Weiss. A gunfight followed. According to the FBI, Weiss was struck multiple times by police gunfire. He then retreated to the classroom where most of the school victims had been killed. Around 2:58 p.m., he died by suicide. The timeline was extraordinarily compressed. Approximately 9 minutes separated Weiss's arrival at the school from his death. Yet reconstructing those 9 minutes required investigators to separate individual events and establish how they fit together. The investigation also had to account for the victims outside the school. Daryl Lucier and Michelle Sagana had been killed before Weiss arrived at the high school. That meant the final death toll could not be understood solely by examining the school. The FBI's active shooter record identified 9 victims killed by Weiss, with 6 additional people injured at the school. Including Weiss, who died by suicide, 10 people died during the overall incident. The numbers became part of the official record, but they also required careful interpretation. Contemporary reports sometimes differed in the number of injured people as information was updated. For that reason, the FBI's figures provide an important reference point when describing the overall event. Yet numbers alone do not explain what happened. Investigators also had to look backward into Weiss's life. After the shooting, attention focused on the 16-year-old's background. People who knew him described him as isolated and quiet, and he was associated with a Gothic style. Before the attack, he had been placed in a homebound education program following a disciplinary problem at school. His family's circumstances were difficult. His father had died by suicide, while his mother was receiving long-term care after an accident. Weiss had also used websites and forums containing extremist material and had posted dark content. Those facts became part of the effort to understand whether there had been warning signs before the shooting. But this was also where the investigation encountered one of its greatest limitations. Finding troubling behavior is not the same as establishing causation. A difficult family history does not, by itself, explain a mass shooting. Isolation does not, by itself, explain it. A Gothic identity does not explain it. Even extremist or disturbing online material does not automatically provide a complete motive. Investigators could identify these circumstances, but the information available does not establish that any one of them was responsible for Weiss's actions. The question of motive was therefore more difficult than the reconstruction of the timeline. What happened could be established with considerable clarity. Why it happened could not. There was another question investigators and the public had to consider. Had Weiss acted alone? The issue became particularly relevant because another teenager, Louis Jourdain, was investigated after the massacre. Jourdain became involved in a separate case concerning threats and alleged plans. He later admitted to a charge involving threatening interstate communications. More serious accusations, including conspiracy to commit murder, were dropped, and his case was handled through the juvenile justice system. His involvement generated questions about whether Weiss had received help or whether someone else had known about the plan. But those questions should not be confused with proof of participation in the shooting. According to the information available, investigators did not establish that Jourdain was an accomplice in the Red Lake massacre. The FBI believed Weiss appeared to have acted alone. This distinction is essential because an investigation can contain multiple people, allegations, and related cases without proving that they all formed part of the same criminal act. In Red Lake, the central sequence remained focused on Weiss. He killed his grandfather and Michelle Sagana, took his grandfather's police equipment and vehicle, traveled to the school, killed Derek Brunn, killed Neva Wincop Rogers and 5 students, wounded others, confronted police, and then died by suicide. The investigation could reconstruct that chain, but the final explanation remained incomplete. Weiss could no longer be questioned. There would be no courtroom testimony in which he could explain his decisions. There would be no opportunity for investigators to ask him why he went to the school, why particular people were killed, or what he believed he was accomplishing. The investigation therefore reached a boundary that evidence alone could not cross. The facts established the actions. They did not provide a complete explanation for the mind behind them. That distinction would shape the rest of the case. The authorities could continue examining Weiss's background and the circumstances surrounding the attack. But they could not turn uncertainty into certainty simply because the public wanted an answer. In the end, the most responsible reconstruction was one that separated what was known from what remained unresolved. The known facts formed a devastating sequence beginning at Lucier's home and ending inside Red Lake High School. The unresolved questions concerned motive, intention, and the precise psychological reasoning behind the attack. And because the person who could have provided the most direct answers was dead, those questions would remain part of the case long after the crime scenes had been processed and the official timeline had been established. By the time investigators had reconstructed the basic sequence of events at Red Lake, one question remained more difficult than any other. Why did Jeff Weiss do it? The timeline itself could be established with relative clarity. On March 21, 2005, Weiss killed his grandfather, Daryl Lucier, and Michelle Sagana at Lucier's home. He then took police equipment, weapons, and Lucier's police vehicle and traveled to Red Lake High School. At approximately 2:49 p.m., he arrived at the school. Derek Brunn was killed at the entrance. Weiss then entered the building, where Neva Wincop Rogers and 5 students were killed, while other people were wounded. Around 2:55 p.m., emergency calls began reaching authorities. Police confronted Weiss, and after being struck by police gunfire, he retreated to a classroom and died by suicide at approximately 58 p.m. The sequence could be reconstructed. The motive could not. That distinction became central to understanding the case. Weiss was 16 years old when he died. Because he did not survive the shooting, investigators could never question him in the ordinary way that investigators might question a suspect after an arrest. There would be no interrogation in which he could explain what he had been thinking. There would be no opportunity to confront him with evidence and ask why he had chosen to kill his grandfather, why he had traveled to the school, or why the people inside the school became his victims. The absence of those answers created a permanent gap in the investigation. Investigators could examine the life that had preceded the massacre. They could identify circumstances that appeared troubling. But those circumstances could not automatically be transformed into a single explanation. People who knew Weiss had described him as isolated and quiet. He was associated with a Gothic style and had experienced problems at school. Before the shooting, he had been placed in a homebound education program following a disciplinary issue. His family life had also included severe difficulties. His father had died by suicide, and his mother was receiving long-term care after an accident. After the massacre, these details naturally attracted attention. They offered possible context for a young person who had committed an extraordinary act of violence. But context is not the same as motive. A difficult childhood does not inevitably produce violence. Isolation does not inevitably produce violence. Problems at school do not inevitably produce violence. Even exposure to extremist or disturbing material does not, by itself, explain why one individual decides to commit murder. Weiss had used websites and forums containing extremist material and had posted dark content. Those activities became part of the retrospective examination of his life, particularly because investigators and the public were trying to determine whether there had been signs of what was coming. But the available information does not establish that these online activities directly caused the massacre, nor does it establish a single ideological purpose behind the attack. The evidence provided does not reveal a definitive manifesto or a clear statement that explains the entire sequence. This uncertainty is especially important when considering the victims at Red Lake High School. It would be tempting to assume that Weiss had selected each person because of a personal grievance. But the available information does not support that conclusion. Investigators did not establish that all of the school victims had been individually chosen targets. Instead, the evidence suggests that the students and staff who were killed were largely people who were present when Weiss entered the school. That makes the tragedy more difficult to reduce to a conventional story of revenge. The deaths did not come with a simple list of grievances that could be matched to individual victims. The question was therefore not merely who had been targeted, but what had brought Weiss to the point where he entered a school with weapons and began shooting. Another question emerged after the massacre. Had someone else been involved? Attention turned in part to another teenager, Louis Jourdain. After the shooting, Jourdain was arrested in connection with an investigation involving threats and alleged plans. His name became significant because the possibility of another person having known about or assisted. Weiss naturally raised questions about whether the massacre had been planned with help. But the existence of a separate case did not establish that Jourdain was an accomplice in the school shooting. Jourdain eventually admitted to a charge involving threatening interstate communications. More serious accusations, including conspiracy to commit murder, were dropped. His case was handled through the juvenile justice system. These facts are important because they demonstrate the difference between suspicion, investigation, accusation, and proof. In the aftermath of a mass killing, there is enormous pressure to find a complete explanation and to determine whether anyone else was responsible. But an investigation can uncover disturbing communications or related allegations without proving that another person participated in the actual shooting. According to the information available, investigators did not establish that Jourdain was part of the attack at Red Lake High School. The FBI believed Weiss appeared to have acted alone. That conclusion returned the focus to the same unanswered question. What was happening inside Weiss's mind? There was no surviving defendant to provide an answer. There was no trial in which the prosecution could present its case and the defense could challenge the evidence. There was no jury that could evaluate a disputed account of events. Weiss's death at the scene meant that the criminal justice process concerning him ended with the shooting itself. In one sense, that made the legal outcome straightforward. There was no possibility of a conviction or sentence because there was no living defendant. In another sense, it made the case more difficult. A trial would not necessarily have produced a complete explanation for the crime, but it could have created a formal setting in which evidence, testimony, and competing interpretations were presented. In Red Lake, that process never occurred. There would be no moment when Weiss had to sit in a courtroom and hear the names of the people he had killed. There would be no opportunity for prosecutors to ask him to account for his decisions. There would be no cross-examination that might expose contradictions in his explanation. Instead, investigators and the public were left with the evidence of what he had done and the incomplete record of who he had been before that afternoon. That absence also affected how the question of motive was discussed. Without a definitive statement from the perpetrator, people could easily fill the silence with speculation. A family tragedy could be treated as the explanation. School problems could be treated as the explanation. Online extremism could be treated as the explanation. Isolation could be treated as the explanation. But the responsible conclusion was more limited. These were elements of Weiss's background, not a proven single cause of the massacre. The distinction may seem unsatisfying, especially in a case involving so many deaths. People naturally want a reason that makes the event understandable. But some crimes do not provide that kind of closure. The Red Lake case is one of them. Investigators could establish the facts surrounding the violence, but they could not obtain a complete account of the psychological process that led to it. The question of whether Weiss had intended to kill particular people also remained unresolved. The information available does not establish that the victims inside the school were selected, according to a clearly documented list of personal targets. What is known is that Weiss entered the school armed, confronted people inside, and killed 7 people there. The victims included security guard Derek Brunn, teacher Neva Wincop Rogers, and 5 students. 6 others were injured at the school, according to the FBI's active shooter record. Those facts required no speculation. The uncertainty began when investigators moved beyond what happened and tried to determine why. This is where the Red Lake case becomes fundamentally different from a conventional criminal investigation involving a surviving suspect. There was no final confession that could be examined. There was no trial testimony. There was no verdict explaining which interpretation of motive the evidence supported. The person who knew the most about his own intentions had died. What remained was a record of actions, background information, witness accounts, and investigative conclusions. Among those conclusions was the belief that Weiss appeared to have acted alone. The separate case involving Louis Jourdain did not change that fundamental assessment. And so the investigation reached an uncomfortable boundary. It could tell the story of the violence, but it could not completely explain the person who carried it out. That distinction would remain important long after the immediate investigation had ended. Red Lake did not leave behind a neat narrative in which every warning sign led inevitably to one final act. It left behind a series of troubling circumstances, an extraordinarily rapid sequence of killings, and a motive that could never be fully established. Perhaps the most honest conclusion is therefore also the simplest. Investigators knew what Jeff Weiss did, but they could never know with complete certainty why he chose to do it. The absence of an answer did not lessen the suffering of the victims or their families. It did not change the reality of what happened inside the school, and it did not erase the responsibility for the deaths. It simply meant that one of the central questions of the case would remain unanswered. For the families and survivors of Red Lake, there was no courtroom moment capable of resolving that uncertainty. There was only the aftermath of an event that had already taken 9 lives and permanently changed a community. The investigation could reconstruct the past. It could not bring the dead back, and it could not ask the dead attacker to explain himself. The case therefore moved beyond the question of conviction and into a different kind of reckoning. How does a community continue after an act of violence whose victims can be counted, whose timeline can be reconstructed, but whose deepest motive remains unknown? The shooting ended within minutes, but the consequences for Red Lake did not. When Jeff Weiss died at the scene, the immediate threat inside the high school was over. For the students and staff who had survived, however, the end of the gunfire was only the beginning of another experience, discovering what had happened, learning who had been killed, finding injured friends and relatives, and confronting the fact that a familiar school had become the site of a massacre. Red Lake was a relatively isolated Ojibwe community in northern Minnesota, and the close relationships within the community meant that the deaths were not experienced as distant tragedies. Families were connected through relatives, friendships, school relationships, and community life. The loss of 9 people killed by Weiss therefore reached far beyond the walls of the high school. The first stage of the aftermath involved establishing who had died and who had survived. At the school, 7 people had been killed: security guard Derek Brunn, teacher Neva Wincop Rogers, and 5 students. Before the school attack, Weiss had killed his grandfather Daryl Lucier and Michelle Sigana. Weiss himself died by suicide after confronting police. In total, 10 people died during the incident when the attacker is included, while 9 were victims of homicide. According to the FBI's active shooter record, 6 people were injured at the school. The exact number of injuries reported in contemporary accounts sometimes differed as information was updated, but the FBI figure provides a consistent reference point. These statistics became part of the official history of the massacre, but they could not capture the full impact on the community. Each number represented a person whose absence would be felt by relatives, friends, classmates, teachers, and neighbors. For the students who survived, the school itself had changed meaning. Before March 21st, Red Lake High School was a place associated with classes, teachers, friendships, and everyday routines. After the shooting, it was also associated with death and fear. The physical building could remain standing, but the emotional meaning attached to it could not simply be restored by reopening its doors. Students who had hidden during the attack had experienced something that most people never expect to encounter in their lives. Some had heard gunfire without initially understanding what it meant. Others had seen Weiss in the hallways. Some had been wounded. Others had watched classmates or teachers become victims. Even students who were not physically injured had been exposed to an event that could fundamentally alter their perception of safety. Cody Thunder's experience illustrates this difference between physical survival and the broader consequences of violence. Thunder was 15 when he was shot in the hip after seeing Weiss through a glass window. He managed to reach shelter, but a bullet remained in his body afterward. Jeffrey May was also seriously wounded and, according to his family, attempted to resist Weiss with a pencil before being shot. These survivors carried physical reminders of the attack, but the impact of surviving could not be measured only through visible injuries. The school community had to deal with the fact that the attack had occurred despite existing security measures. Red Lake High School had surveillance cameras, fencing, screening at the entrance, and a security guard. Those measures had been intended to make the school safer, yet they could not prevent the tragedy. Derek Brunn, the security guard, had actually recognized that something was wrong when Weiss approached and moved toward the entrance. He was killed before the attacker entered the building. The sequence demonstrated the limits of security when an armed attacker reaches a school and events move with extreme speed. It would be inaccurate to interpret the existence of security measures as proof that nothing could have been done differently. But it would be equally inaccurate to suggest that the school simply had no security at all. The facts show something more complicated. Precautions existed, a security guard responded, warnings were issued, emergency calls were made, and police arrived. Yet the attack still caused devastating loss within minutes. The aftermath also raised broader questions about the circumstances that preceded the massacre. Investigators and the public looked closely at Jeff Weiss's life. He had been described as isolated and quiet. He had experienced problems at school and had been placed in the homebound program after a disciplinary issue. His father had died by suicide, and his mother was receiving long-term care following an accident. He had also used websites and forums containing extremist material and had posted dark content. These details became part of the search for warning signs. The impulse was understandable. When something as devastating as Red Lake occurs, people naturally look backward and ask whether the event could have been predicted. Were there indications that something terrible was coming? Could someone have recognized a change in behavior? Was there a moment when intervention might have altered the outcome? But the investigation did not establish one simple answer. The distinction between a warning sign and a proven cause is critical. A troubled family background does not automatically lead to mass violence. Social isolation does not automatically lead to mass violence. A Gothic identity does not automatically lead to violence. Disturbing online material may be relevant to an investigation, but it does not by itself explain why a particular person commits murder. The evidence available did not identify a single factor that could adequately explain Weiss's actions. This uncertainty became part of the tragedy itself. The community had to mourn without receiving a definitive explanation from the person responsible. Because Weiss died at the scene, there was no criminal trial. There would be no prosecution in which his motives could be examined in court, and no opportunity to hear his own explanation under questioning. The legal process could not provide the kind of narrative closure that sometimes follows a major criminal case. Instead, investigators had to rely on witness accounts, the established timeline, and the available evidence concerning Weiss's background and actions. Another source of public concern involved Louis Jourdain. After the massacre, Jourdain was arrested in connection with a separate investigation involving threats and alleged plans. He later admitted to a charge involving threatening interstate communications. More serious accusations, including conspiracy to commit murder, were dropped, and his case was handled through the juvenile justice system. His case generated questions about whether Weiss had received assistance or whether someone else had known about his intentions. But the available evidence did not establish that Jourdain was an accomplice in the Red Lake shooting. Investigators believed Weiss appeared to have acted alone. This distinction was important for the community because the fear created by the massacre could easily produce rumors and assumptions about other people being involved. The evidence, however, did not support turning those suspicions into conclusions. Red Lake, therefore, had to process two kinds of uncertainty at once. There was uncertainty about motive, because Weiss was dead and no definitive explanation existed. And there was uncertainty in the immediate aftermath about exactly what had happened to individual people during the attack. Investigators could reconstruct much of the sequence, but families still had to experience the loss personally. The community's response could not be limited to the official timeline. The deaths of Brunn, Rogers, the 5 students, Lucier, and Sigana represented different relationships and different forms of loss. The school victims were especially painful because they belonged to a place where young people were expected to be safe. A teacher and students were killed while inside a school. A security guard was killed while attempting to respond to the danger. The first 2 victims were killed in a family setting before the attack reached the school. Together, these deaths showed how rapidly violence had spread through different parts of the community. The attack had begun inside a home and ended inside a school, but its effects extended into nearly every part of Red Lake life. The surviving students also had to confront the return to an environment that could no longer feel entirely ordinary. A school is built around repetition. Students return to the same classrooms, walk the same corridors, see the same teachers, and recognize the same faces. After a shooting, those routines can become reminders of what happened. A hallway can recall the sound of gunfire. A classroom can recall the people who were there. A doorway can become associated with the attempt to hide. The supplied information does not document every individual survivor's later experience, so it would be wrong to invent specific emotional reactions. But the broader consequence is clear: the massacre affected the entire community, not only the people who were physically wounded. Minnesota Public Radio described the incident as a disaster affecting the reservation and a close-knit community in which families and relationships were deeply interconnected. That description helps explain why the aftermath was larger than the crime scene itself. The community was forced to mourn collectively while also dealing with the individual grief of families who had lost loved ones. And perhaps the most painful feature of the aftermath was that there could be no complete explanation waiting at the end of the investigation. The timeline could be reconstructed. The victims could be identified. The weapons, vehicle, and movements could be documented. The sequence from Lucier's home to the school and finally to the confrontation with police could be established. But the central question of why remained. Red Lake therefore entered the long period that follows a mass tragedy. Remembrance without complete understanding. The dead could not return. The survivors could not simply forget. The school could not become what it had been before. And the community had to continue living with an event that had taken place in less than an hour but would remain part of its history indefinitely. After the immediate aftermath had passed, the Red Lake investigation entered a different phase. The emergency response had ended, the attacker was dead, and the school and the surrounding locations had become crime scenes rather than active threats. Investigators could now work backward through the sequence, examining what happened at Daryl-Lucier's home, how Jeff Weiss obtained the weapons and police equipment, how he traveled to Red Lake High School, what occurred inside the building, and how the confrontation with police ended. The physical sequence was horrifying, but it was also comparatively clear. The deeper problem was that the investigation could reconstruct actions without obtaining a complete explanation for them. The first major task was to connect the two locations. Lucier's home and Red Lake High School could not be investigated as unrelated crimes because the same person had moved from one location to the other. Lucier, Weiss's grandfather and a Red Lake police officer, had been killed along with Michelle Sagana. Afterward, Weiss took police equipment belonging to Lucier, including weapons and body armor, and used Lucier's police vehicle to travel to the school. According to the FBI, Weiss carried a shotgun and 2 handguns. This sequence established the connection between the first killings and the later attack. It also demonstrated how quickly the situation escalated. Weiss did not remain at the first crime scene. He moved from a private residence into a public institution containing approximately 300 students. By approximately 2:49 p.m., he was at the high school. Investigators then had to reconstruct the attack from the accounts of survivors and the established timeline. Derek Brunn, the 28-year-old security guard, saw Weiss approaching and recognized that something was wrong. A warning was issued, and Brunn moved toward the entrance. Weiss shot him there and entered the school. Inside, students and staff reacted to the sound of gunfire in different ways. Some ran. Others locked themselves inside classrooms. Some people did not initially understand what the sounds meant or where the attacker was. Teacher Neva Wincop Rogers and a group of students attempted to take shelter in a classroom after the shooting began. Weiss reached them, and Rogers and 5 students were killed. Elsewhere in the building, students tried to avoid him. Witness accounts described Weiss firing at doors or attempting to reach areas where students had hidden. 6 people were injured at the school according to the FBI's active shooter record. Among the survivors were Cody Thunder and Jeffrey May. Thunder, 15, was in a biology classroom when he saw Weiss through a glass window. He initially thought the weapon might be a paintball gun or that Weiss might be joking. Then Weiss fired, striking Thunder in the hip. Thunder managed to reach shelter, and a bullet remained in his body afterward. May was also seriously wounded. According to his family, he attempted to resist Weiss with a pencil before being shot. Such accounts were important to investigators because they provided individual perspectives on a rapidly changing event. But no single witness could describe everything. The attack was too fast, and the school environment was too divided into different spaces. One student might know what was happening in one hallway, while another knew only that gunfire had been heard nearby. A person hiding behind a locked door could not see what was happening elsewhere. The investigation, therefore, depended on assembling many fragments into a coherent timeline. At approximately 2:55 p.m., 911 calls began reaching authorities. Police responded to the school and confronted Weiss. A gunfight followed, during which Weiss was struck multiple times by police gunfire. He then withdrew toward the classroom where most of the school victims had been killed. Around 2:58 p.m., he died by suicide, shooting himself in the head. The entire school attack had therefore unfolded in approximately 9 minutes. That short period was one of the most significant facts established by the investigation. The attack was not a prolonged siege. It was a rapid sequence in which the attacker moved through the school. People attempted to escape or hide. Emergency calls were made, and police arrived before Weiss ultimately killed himself. The speed of the event also helps explain why even a school equipped with security measures could not completely prevent the loss of life. Red Lake High School had cameras, fencing, entrance screening, and a security guard. Brunn responded when he recognized the danger. Emergency calls were made. Police arrived. Yet the attack still caused 9 homicides and multiple injuries. The investigation, therefore, had to distinguish between the existence of security and the ability of those measures to stop an attack once it had already begun. The next major investigative question was motive. This was where the evidence became less definitive. Weiss had been described as isolated and quiet. He had experienced disciplinary problems at school and had been placed in the homebound program. His family history included his father's suicide and his mother's long-term care following an accident. He had also used websites and forums containing extremist material and had posted dark content. These details attracted considerable attention because investigators and the public wanted to understand whether they represented a progression toward violence. But the available evidence does not establish that any one of these factors was the cause of the massacre. It is possible to identify circumstances without knowing exactly how they interacted inside a person's mind. That distinction is essential. If the investigation had found a single written statement explaining the attack, the case might have had a clearer narrative. But the information provided does not identify such a definitive explanation. Nor did investigators establish that all of the school victims were personally selected targets. This meant that the deaths could not simply be explained as an act of revenge against specific individuals. Some victims may have been encountered during the attack rather than selected because of a known personal dispute. The available evidence does not allow every individual killing to be assigned a specific motive. That uncertainty became even more significant because Weiss died before he could be questioned. There would be no trial. There would be no opportunity for prosecutors to present their theory of the crime and ask Weiss to respond. There would be no defense attorney challenging the evidence on his behalf. There would be no jury verdict establishing a legal conclusion about motive. The criminal justice system could not provide the kind of formal ending that normally follows a major homicide investigation. Instead, the official record would have to rely on the evidence collected after the fact. Another part of the investigation involved Louis Jourdain. His case became relevant because of questions about whether Weiss had received assistance or whether other people had known about his intentions. Jourdain was investigated and later admitted to a charge involving threatening interstate communications. More serious allegations, including conspiracy to commit murder, were dropped. His case was handled through the juvenile justice system. The existence of Jourdain's case did not establish that he participated in the Red Lake shooting. According to the available information, investigators did not find evidence demonstrating that Jourdain was an accomplice to the massacre. The FBI believed Weiss appeared to have acted alone. This conclusion is important because it prevents a related investigation from being mistaken for proof of a wider conspiracy. The central sequence remained the same. Weiss committed the killings at his grandfather's home, took the police equipment and vehicle, went to the school, attacked people inside, confronted police, and died by suicide. The investigation could establish those facts. It could also establish the number of victims and the approximate timing of the attack. What it could not establish with the same certainty was the internal reasoning that connected one decision to the next. That is where the case remains unresolved. A criminal investigation can be extremely effective at answering questions of who, what, when, and where. It can be much less capable of answering why, particularly when the perpetrator is dead. In Red Lake, investigators were left with the evidence of behavior rather than a complete explanation of intent. That limitation should not be mistaken for investigative failure. Some questions simply cannot be answered after the person who could answer them is gone. The investigation could also not transform every troubling aspect of Weiss's background into a prediction of violence. His isolation, family difficulties, school problems, Gothic identity, and disturbing online activity could all be examined. None could legitimately be presented as a guaranteed warning that the massacre would occur. Hindsight creates a dangerous illusion that the future was obvious. Once people know what happened, earlier details can appear more significant than they actually were at the time. The responsible conclusion is narrower. There were troubling aspects of Weiss's background, but investigators did not identify one factor that fully explained the attack. Ultimately, the investigation produced a detailed account of the violence, but not a complete explanation of the mind behind it. 9 people had been killed by Weiss. 6 others were injured at the school, according to the FBI record, and the attacker himself had died. The victims could be named. The locations could be identified. The timeline could be reconstructed. The weapons and vehicle could be connected to the first crime scene. Witnesses could describe fragments of the attack. Police could document their confrontation with Weiss. Yet the final question remained beyond reach. Why did a 16-year-old decide to kill his grandfather, kill his grandfather's partner, travel to a school, and kill students and staff before taking his own life? The investigation could approach that question, but it could not answer it completely. And because there was no trial, the unanswered question would remain not as a disputed courtroom issue, but as a permanent part of the history of Red Lake. The final stage of the story would therefore not be about discovering a hidden motive that investigators somehow missed. It would be about understanding what remained after the facts had been established. A community forced to remember 9 victims, survivors carrying the consequences of the attack, families living with irreversible loss, and a school whose history had been permanently divided into a time before March 21, 2005, and a time after it. The story of Red Lake High School does not end at 2:58 p.m. on March 21, 2005, when Jeff Weiss died by suicide. That moment ended the immediate violence, but it did not end the consequences. For the people who had lost family members, for the students and staff who survived, and for the wider Red Lake community, the event continued long after the final gunshot. The official timeline could be completed. The victims could be counted. The investigation could establish how Weiss moved from his grandfather's home to the school and how the confrontation with police ended. But a timeline cannot measure grief, and an investigation cannot restore the people who were killed. The first fact that must remain at the center of the story is the human cost. Weiss killed 9 people. 2 were killed before he reached the school: his grandfather, Daryl Lucier, a Red Lake police officer, and Michelle Sigana, Lucier's partner. At the high school, 7 more people were killed: security guard Derek Brunn, teacher Neva Wincop Rogers, and 5 students. Weiss then killed himself. bringing the total number of deaths connected to the incident to 10 when the perpetrator is included. The FBI recorded 6 people injured at the school. These numbers provide a factual framework, but they are not the story itself. Behind every number was a person with family, relationships, responsibilities, and a place in the community. The attack also left survivors with memories of a few minutes that had changed their lives. 15-year-old Cody Thunder was shot in the hip after seeing Weiss through a glass window and, initially believing the weapon might be a paintball gun or that Weiss could be joking. He survived and reached shelter, but a bullet remained in his body afterward. Jeffrey May was seriously wounded and, according to his family, attempted to resist Weiss with a pencil before being shot. Their experiences demonstrate the difference between surviving an attack physically and escaping its consequences entirely. The supplied information does not provide a complete account of what every survivor experienced afterward, and it would be wrong to invent individual reactions. What can be said is that the students and staff who survived had been forced to experience lethal violence inside a place that had previously been part of their ordinary lives. Red Lake High School had been a familiar environment. It had classrooms, teachers, students, security procedures, and daily routines. On March 21st, all of those familiar elements became associated with an extraordinary act of violence. The school had security measures in place before the shooting. There were cameras, fencing, screening at the entrance, and a security guard. Derek Brunn was performing that security role when he saw Weiss approaching and recognized that something was wrong. A warning was issued, and Brunn moved toward the entrance. He was killed there. This detail is important because it demonstrates that the tragedy cannot simply be reduced to the absence of security. Measures existed. A security guard responded. Emergency calls were made. Police arrived. Yet the attack unfolded so quickly that the available protections could not prevent the deaths. The entire school shooting lasted only approximately 9 minutes, from Weiss's arrival around 2:49 p.m. to his suicide around 2:58 p.m. Within that narrow period, the school changed from a place of ordinary activity into the center of a deadly emergency. The speed of the attack is one of its most disturbing characteristics. There was no prolonged period in which the community could slowly understand what was happening. Students heard gunfire, people ran or hid, some were wounded, police were called, and officers confronted the attacker. The sequence moved faster than a complete understanding of it could spread through the building. That reality also explains why survivor accounts are so important. Each person experienced only a fragment of the larger event. One student might have seen Weiss in a hallway. Another might have heard gunfire from a classroom. Someone else might have seen a friend running. Another person might have been wounded and focused only on reaching safety. Later, investigators could place these fragments into a broader timeline. At the time, however, there was no complete picture. The investigation itself eventually established a sequence beginning at Lucier's home. Weiss killed Lucier and Sigana, took his grandfather's police equipment and vehicle, and traveled to the school carrying a shotgun and 2 handguns. He killed Brunn at the entrance, entered the school, killed Rogers and 5 students, wounded others, confronted police, and then died by suicide. That sequence is known. What remains less certain is the motive. This uncertainty is one of the defining features of the case. Weiss had been described as isolated and quiet. He had experienced a disciplinary problem at school and had been placed in the homebound education program. His family history included his father's suicide and his mother's long-term care after an accident. He had also used websites and forums containing extremist material and had posted dark content. All of these details were examined after the massacre, but none provides a complete explanation. It is important not to turn background circumstances into simplistic causes. Family tragedy does not automatically produce violence. Isolation does not automatically produce violence. A Gothic identity does not automatically produce violence. Disturbing online material does not automatically explain a mass killing. The investigation did not establish a single factor that could account for everything Weiss did. Nor did investigators establish that all of the people killed at the school were individually selected targets. The evidence provided does not show a clear list of personal enemies whose deaths had been planned for specific reasons. The victims were largely students and staff who were present when the attack took place. This makes the absence of a definitive motive even more difficult for the community to accept. People naturally want to know why a person committed an act of extreme violence. They want to believe that if the reason can be discovered, the event can somehow be understood. But in Red Lake, the person who could have provided the most direct explanation was dead. There was no interrogation after the shooting. There was no criminal trial. There was no courtroom testimony in which Weiss could be questioned about his decisions. There was no jury verdict that could establish a legal explanation of motive. The separate investigation involving Louis Jourdain also did not provide the missing answer. Jourdain was investigated in connection with threats and later admitted to a charge involving threatening interstate communications. More serious accusations, including conspiracy to commit murder, were dropped. His case was handled through the juvenile justice system. Although his involvement raised public questions about whether Weiss had received assistance or whether another person knew about the plan, the available information does not establish that Jourdain was an accomplice to the Red Lake shooting. Investigators believed Weiss appeared to have acted alone. That conclusion is significant because it demonstrates how the investigation separated suspicion from evidence. The existence of another troubling case did not automatically mean that another person participated in the massacre. In the end, the evidence led investigators back to Weiss himself. But even with the perpetrator identified, the deepest question remained unresolved. The Red Lake community therefore had to move forward without the kind of closure that a surviving perpetrator might sometimes provide. There could be no final explanation from Weiss. There could be no apology delivered in court. There could be no sentence that marked the legal conclusion of the case. His suicide meant that the criminal process ended with his death. For the families of the victims, that reality could not make the losses less painful. A trial might have provided information, but no trial could have returned the dead. The people of Red Lake were left with the much more difficult task of remembering and continuing. Minnesota Public Radio described the event as a disaster affecting the reservation and a close-knit community. That description captures an important truth about the aftermath. In a small, interconnected community, the effects of a tragedy do not remain confined to one household. The loss of a student affects classmates. The loss of a teacher affects students and colleagues. The death of a police officer affects both family and community. The killing of multiple people within such a short period creates a shared memory that can become part of the community's identity. But remembering should not mean allowing the perpetrator to dominate the story. Jeff Weiss's name is inseparable from the case. But the most important names are those of the people who were killed and those who survived. Derek Brunn was a security guard who responded when he saw danger. Neva Wincop Rogers was a teacher caught in the attack alongside her students. 5 students lost their lives inside their school. Daryl Lucier and Michelle Sagana were killed before the school attack even began. Their deaths were not simply preliminary events. They were part of the same chain of violence. And the survivors, including those who were physically wounded, carried the story beyond the day itself. The final lesson of Red Lake is therefore not a simple warning that one particular type of person becomes violent. The case does not support such a conclusion. It does not show that Gothic appearance, isolation, family difficulties, school discipline problems, or disturbing internet activity inevitably lead to murder. Instead, it demonstrates the danger of searching for one easy explanation for a complex act of violence. The responsible approach is to acknowledge what is known and what is not. We know the sequence. We know the victims. We know how the attack ended. We know that Weiss acted alone according to the available investigative conclusion. We know that he died before a trial could take place. but we do not possess a complete explanation of why he made the decisions he made. That unanswered question is not a reason to romanticize the perpetrator or make his motives seem mysterious or extraordinary. It is simply a limitation of what the evidence can tell us. The most meaningful way to remember Red Lake is therefore to keep the focus where it belongs, on the people whose lives were taken and on the community that had to survive their loss. March 21st, 2005 lasted only one afternoon. The violence at the school lasted only minutes. But for the families and survivors, the consequences did not end when the police confrontation ended. A school can be repaired, a timeline can be written, an investigation can be completed, but a life cannot be reconstructed once it has been taken. That is the final reality of Red Lake. The case may remain defined by unanswered questions about motive, but the victims do not need an explanation in order for their lives to have mattered. Their absence is the most enduring fact left behind. And perhaps that is where the story should finally end, not with the person who caused the violence, but with the people and community who were forced to live with what he left behind.